There is a particular kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with raw cognitive capacity, and its absence has destroyed more careers, more fortunes, more reputations than any deficit of talent ever could. You have likely watched it happen, perhaps in your own life, perhaps in the unraveling of someone you once admired, a person of genuine ability, genuine charm, genuine capability, makes a decision that feels, in the moment, entirely justified, even satisfying, only to discover, weeks or months or years later, that this single decision has set in motion a chain of consequences that quietly, methodically dismantles everything that decision was meant to protect or advance. This is the law of short-sightedness, and it describes one of the most consistent, most universal, and most underestimated weaknesses in human judgment. Our overwhelming, almost gravitational tendency to weigh the immediate, vivid, emotionally available present far more heavily than the distant, abstract, emotionally muted future. Even when careful, dispassionate calculation would clearly favor the opposite weighting. This is not a flaw confined to the reckless or the unintelligent. It operates with nearly equal force upon the brilliant and the dull, the disciplined and the impulsive, because it is built into the very architecture of how the human mind evaluates time, risk, and reward, a feature of our cognition so deeply embedded that recognizing and overriding it requires a degree of deliberate, sustained effort that most people, most of the time, simply do not invest. To understand why this law exerts such powerful and consistent influence over human decision-making, we must examine the underlying psychological and evolutionary architecture that produced it, because, as with so many of the persistent patterns shaping human behavior, this one traces back to conditions our minds evolved to navigate long before the modern world introduced the kind of long, complex causal chains between present action and future consequence that short-sightedness so reliably fails to account for. For the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, the immediate environment posed dangers and opportunities that demanded immediate response. Predator approaching demanded immediate evasive action, not careful deliberation about long-term strategic positioning. An opportunity to secure food when it appeared needed to be seized promptly before a rival claimed it or the opportunity itself disappeared. Under these ancestral conditions, a cognitive system finely tuned to prioritize immediate, vivid, concrete information over distant, abstract, uncertain future consequences represented a significant survival advantage rather than a liability. The mind that hesitated, weighing long-term abstract considerations while immediate danger or opportunity demanded swift action, would have been reliably outcompeted by the mind wired to act decisively on whatever was most immediately present and vivid. This evolutionary heritage produced a psychological architecture in which the present moment carries a kind of automatic, almost irresistible weight in our calculations, a weight considerably disproportionate to its actual long-term significance in the comparatively stable, complex, and consequence-laden environment of modern human civilization. The modern world, with its long careers, its compounding financial decisions, its reputations built and destroyed across years rather than moments, its relationships sustained or damaged through patterns repeated across decades, demands a kind of patient, long-horizon thinking that our ancestral cognitive architecture was never specifically designed to provide, and that, as a result, requires considerable deliberate effort to develop and maintain. Consider first how this law manifests within the specific domain of professional decision-making, where its effects prove both remarkably consistent and remarkably costly. Examine carefully the trajectory of individuals who have achieved early professional success, only to subsequently undermine that success through a pattern of decisions that, viewed individually, Each appeared reasonable, even shrewd, in the immediate context in which they were made, but that, viewed collectively across a longer arc of time, reveal a consistent and devastating pattern of prioritizing immediate gratification, immediate relief, or immediate advantage over the cultivation of long-term position, reputation, and capability. Consider the talented employee who, frustrated by a temporary setback or a perceived slight, fires off an intemperate email or makes a cutting remark in a meeting, securing the immediate, visceral satisfaction of expressing genuine frustration while permanently damaging a professional relationship that might have proven valuable across years or even decades of subsequent collaboration. In the heat of that immediate moment, the satisfaction of expressing frustration feels real, concrete, and immediately available, while the abstract, hypothetical cost of a damaged relationship remains distant, uncertain, and easy to discount, precisely because it has not yet materialized into any concrete, immediately felt consequence. Only later, often considerably later, does the true cost of that momentary indulgence become apparent, and the damaged relationship fails to provide an opportunity, a recommendation, or a partnership that would otherwise have been readily available. Consider, too, the entrepreneur who, faced with a choice between a quick, immediately lucrative deal that compromises the long-term reputation and strategic positioning of his enterprise, and a more patient, more disciplined path that sacrifices immediate gain in service of long-term value, repeatedly chooses the immediate gain, rationalizing each individual choice as a reasonable, even necessary response to present circumstances, while failing to recognize the cumulative, compounding costs these repeated choices impose on the long-term trajectory of the enterprise as a whole. Each individual decision, examined in isolation, might even appear defensible. It is only the accumulated pattern, examined across a sufficiently long horizon, that reveals the devastating consistency of a mind systematically discounting the future in favor of the present. This brings us to one of the most important and most frequently overlooked principles embedded within the law of short-sightedness. The consequences of present-favoring decisions rarely announce themselves immediately, and this delay between cause and consequence represents precisely the mechanism that allows short-sighted patterns to persist, often for years, without triggering the kind of corrective feedback that might otherwise interrupt them. Decision that prioritizes immediate relief or immediate gain over long-term position frequently produces, in the short term, exactly the satisfaction or advantage it promised, creating a powerful, immediate reinforcement that obscures the slower, more diffuse, and ultimately more significant cost accumulating in the background, a cost that frequently does not become fully visible until the cumulative weight of many such decisions, compounded across months or years, finally produces a consequence too significant to ignore. Consider, second, how this law manifests within the domain of personal finance and material consumption, where its effects, while perhaps more widely discussed than their professional and relational counterparts, remain persistently underestimated even by individuals who possess considerable intellectual awareness of the underlying mechanism. The fundamental challenge of personal financial discipline has remarkably little to do with mathematical literacy or access to sound financial information, resources that are, in the modern world, more widely available than at any previous point in human history. The fundamental challenge lies, instead, almost entirely within the domain the law of short-sightedness describes, the persistent, almost gravitational pull toward immediate consumption and immediate gratification, weighed against the abstract, distant, emotionally muted promise of future security that patient saving and disciplined investment provide. This explains why financial education alone however thorough and however widely disseminated, consistently fails to produce proportionate improvements in actual financial behavior across populations exposed to it. The problem was never primarily a deficit of knowledge. It was and remains a deficit in the capacity to weight a distant, abstract future benefit with anything approaching the emotional and motivational force that an immediate, concrete present temptation automatically commands. A person can possess complete, accurate knowledge of compound interest, the mathematical advantages of early and consistent investment, of the genuine, quantifiable cost that present consumption imposes on future security, and can still, in the immediate moment of decision, find that knowledge entirely overwhelmed by the vivid, immediate pull of a present opportunity for consumption or pleasure that the abstract future cannot compete with on the same emotional terms. Consider, third, how this law manifests within the domain of health and physical well-being, where its effects prove perhaps most universally recognized, even as they remain stubbornly resistant to correction despite this near-universal recognition. The fundamental structure of nearly every significant health behavior, dietary choice, exercise discipline, substance use, sleep habits, involves precisely the same temporal conflict the law of short-sightedness describes. An immediate, vivid, concrete temptation or convenience, weighed against a distant, abstract, probabilistic future cost that typically does not manifest as a concrete, felt consequence until years, sometimes decades, after the relevant behavioral pattern was established. This temporal structure explains why health behaviors prove so remarkably resistant to change even among individuals who possess complete, accurate knowledge of the relevant risks and consequences. The immediate pleasure of a particular food, the immediate comfort of avoiding physical exertion, the immediate relief provided by a particular substance, all carry a vivid, concrete, immediately felt weight in the moment of decision that the abstract, statistical, distant future cost of accumulated poor health simply cannot match, regardless of how thoroughly that future cost has been intellectually understood and accepted as genuinely significant. Consider, fourth, how this law manifests within the domain of relationships and reputation. Perhaps the domain in which its long-term consequences prove most devastating precisely because reputation and relationship, once damaged, frequently prove far more difficult to rebuild than financial position or physical health. A single instance of dishonesty, betrayal, or unreliability, undertaken in pursuit of some immediate advantage or relief, frequently produces, in the moment, exactly the benefit it was intended to secure. The lie successfully avoids an uncomfortable, immediate confrontation. Betrayal successfully secures some immediate competitive advantage. Broken commitment successfully avoids some immediate inconvenience or cost. Yet reputation once established as unreliable or untrustworthy within a particular melody, professional or social network, frequently proves remarkably difficult and remarkably slow to rebuild, precisely because trust, unlike many other resources, accumulates gradually through consistent demonstrated behavior across time and depletes, by contrast, with devastating speed and disproportionate severity the moment a single, significant violation becomes known. This asymmetry, slow accumulation paired with rapid depletion, means that the law of short-sightedness proves particularly costly within the domain of reputation and trust, because the immediate benefit secured through a single short-sighted violation typically proves dramatically smaller than the long-term cost that violation eventually imposes once its consequences for reputation and trust have fully materialized. Yet, this asymmetry, however mathematically clear when examined dispassionately, frequently fails to exert sufficient influence at the actual moment of decision, precisely because the immediate benefit feels concrete and certain, while the long-term reputational cost feels abstract, probabilistic, and easy to discount, right up until the moment it finally unmistakably arrives. It is worth examining closely why even genuinely intelligent, generally disciplined individuals so consistently fall victim to this pattern, because understanding the specific cognitive mechanisms involved offers considerably more practical guidance than simply observing that short-sightedness exists and causes harm. Several distinct psychological mechanisms combine to produce the persistent power of this law, and recognizing each of them individually offers considerable insight into how the pattern might be more effectively interrupted. The first mechanism involves what might be called temporal discounting, the well-documented tendency of human cognition to systematically undervalue future rewards and costs relative to their mathematically equivalent present counterparts, a tendency that operates with remarkable consistency across virtually every domain of decision-making that has been carefully studied, and that intensifies considerably as the relevant future consequence grows more temporally distant. A cost or benefit anticipated next week exerts considerably more influence on present decision-making than the mathematically identical cost or benefit anticipated next year, even when no genuine uncertainty distinguishes the two beyond their differing temporal distance, a pattern that reveals temporal discounting to operate as a largely automatic cognitive bias rather than as a reasoned, deliberate weighting of genuine uncertainty. Second mechanism involves what might be called vividness asymmetry, a tendency for immediate, concrete, sensorially rich, present circumstances to command disproportionate cognitive and emotional attention relative to abstract, statistical, sensorily impoverished future possibilities, regardless of their relative mathematical significance. The immediate pleasure of a particular indulgence, the immediate relief of avoiding a difficult conversation, the immediate satisfaction of a cutting remark delivered in anger, all carry a vivid, concrete, immediately felt, emotional reality that the abstract, statistical, future-oriented cost of these same choices simply cannot match in terms of their immediate psychological impact, regardless of how thoroughly that future cost has been intellectually understood and accepted as genuinely significant. The third mechanism involves what might be called consequence diffusion, the tendency for the costs of short-sighted decisions to accumulate gradually and diffusely across many individual decisions, rather than manifesting as a single, clearly identifiable consequence directly attributable to any single choice. This diffusion makes it remarkably difficult, in the moment of any individual decision, to perceive clearly the genuine, cumulative cost that decision contributes to a larger, slowly accumulating pattern, because no single decision, examined in isolation, typically produces a consequence severe enough to trigger the kind of corrective alarm that a single, clearly identifiable catastrophic consequence would reliably produce. Fourth mechanism involves what might be called rationalization capacity, the remarkable cognitive flexibility human beings display in constructing plausible, often genuinely convincing justifications for short-sighted decisions at the precise moment those decisions are being made. Justifications that frequently dissolve under more careful, dispassionate scrutiny conducted at a later point, once the immediate emotional pressure favoring the short-sighted choice has subsided. This capacity for in-the-moment rationalization means that short-sighted decisions rarely feel, to the person making them, like genuine failures of judgment. They feel instead like reasonable, even necessary responses to legitimate present circumstances, a feeling that persists right up until the accumulated consequences of a sustained pattern finally force a more honest reckoning. History and biography offer abundant illustration of this pattern, operating at scales extending well beyond individual personal decisions. And examining these illustrations closely reveals the law of short-sightedness, operating with remarkable consistency across remarkably varied domains and eras. Consider the particular trajectory common among historical leaders and institutions that achieved considerable initial success through bold, decisive action, only to subsequently collapse through a pattern of decisions that consistently prioritized immediate advantage over long-term strategic position. Empires that expanded successfully through aggressive, immediate territorial acquisition frequently demonstrated, upon closer historical examination, corresponding failure to invest adequately in the slower, less immediately rewarding work of building durable administrative, economic, and institutional infrastructure capable of sustaining that expansion across subsequent generations, producing a pattern of rapid initial success followed by a comparably rapid subsequent collapse once the accumulated cost of this systematic underinvestment in long-term institutional capacity finally came due. Consider, too, the particular pattern frequently observed within commercial enterprises that achieved impressive short-term financial performance through decisions, cost-cutting measures that degraded product quality or customer experience, aggressive sales tactics that damaged long-term customer trust, financial engineering that inflated short-term metrics at the expense of genuine underlying business health, that satisfied immediate performance expectations while systematically undermining the long-term competitive position and institutional health of the enterprise. Such patterns frequently persist for a remarkably long time before their cumulative cost becomes undeniable, precisely because the immediate financial metrics these decisions were designed to satisfy continue showing strong performance right up until the accumulated underlying damage finally produces a consequence too significant for those metrics to continue obscuring. What then can be done? How does one develop genuine, durable resistance to a pattern so deeply embedded within the basic architecture of human cognition? A pattern that operates, as we have established, with nearly equal force upon the intelligent and the unintelligent, the disciplined and the impulsive alike. The first essential principle involves the deliberate cultivation of what might be called future vividness, a set of practices specifically designed to counteract the natural asymmetry between vivid present circumstances and abstract future consequences by deliberately, artificially, increasing the vividness and emotional immediacy of future outcomes within your own decision-making process. This might involve concrete visualization exercises, detailed written projections of where a particular pattern of decisions will likely lead across a specific future time frame, or deliberate exposure to vivid, concrete examples of others who have experienced the long-term consequences of similar short-sighted patterns, all undertaken specifically to counteract the natural tendency for abstract future consequences to carry insufficient weight relative to immediate present circumstances. The second essential principle involves the deliberate construction of structural commitments and constraints that remove the need for in-the-moment willpower entirely, recognizing that willpower itself proves a remarkably unreliable defense against the law of short-sightedness. Precisely because the same vivid, immediate pressures that produce short-sighted decisions also reliably degrade the cognitive resources required to resist them. Automatic savings arrangements that remove the need for repeated, willpower-dependent decisions about whether to save or spend. Structural commitments that make certain short-sighted options simply unavailable rather than merely undesirable. And the deliberate construction of environments and routines that reduce exposure to the kind of immediate temptations that reliably trigger short-sighted decision-making, all represent considerably more reliable strategies than the simple, repeated exercise of willpower and discipline, which inevitably depletes precisely when it is needed most. The third essential principle involves developing the specific habit of examining your own decisions, not in isolation, but as instances within a larger accumulating pattern, asking, before any individual decision with potential long-term consequence, not simply whether this particular choice seems reasonable given present circumstances, but whether a sustained pattern of similar choices, repeated consistently across an extended time frame, would produce an outcome you would genuinely endorse upon careful, dispassionate reflection. This habit of pattern-level rather than instance-level evaluation directly counteracts the consequence diffusion mechanism we examined earlier, making visible, at the moment of individual decision, the kind of cumulative cost that would otherwise remain comfortably invisible until its eventual, undeniable manifestation. The fourth essential principle involves the deliberate cultivation of mentors, advisors, or trusted colleagues specifically empowered to provide an external, less emotionally invested perspective on decisions where your own judgment may be compromised by the immediate, emotional pressures that reliably favor short-sighted choices. Because the rationalization capacity we examined earlier operates with particular force precisely when an individual is evaluating his own decisions in isolation, without external perspective or accountability. The deliberate cultivation of trusted outside perspective, particularly from individuals whose own incentives are not similarly distorted by the immediate emotional pressures affecting your own judgment, provides a valuable check against the kind of in-the-moment rationalization that otherwise allows short-sighted patterns to persist unchallenged. There is, finally, a broader and more philosophical dimension to studying the law of short-sightedness closely, one that extends well beyond practical strategy into a deeper understanding of the stun relationship between immediate experience and long-term outcome that governs nearly every domain of meaningful human achievement. Those who have studied the patterns of genuinely exceptional, durable success across history and across domains, success that persists and compounds across decades, rather than producing brief, unsustainable flashes of advantage followed by inevitable collapse, consistently identify the capacity to resist this law, to weight long-term consequence with something approaching the seriousness that immediate present circumstance automatically commands, as among the single most important and most consistently underestimated determinants of which individuals and institutions ultimately achieve lasting significance, and which, despite considerable talent and considerable early promise, ultimately succumb to the accumulated cost of choices that prioritize the present at the systematic expense of the future. This recognition carries a significant and genuinely demanding implication for anyone seriously committed to building lasting achievement in any domain. That genuine mastery requires not merely talent, effort, and intelligence, considerable as these may be, but the additional, considerably rarer capacity to maintain consistent, disciplined attention to long-term consequence, even when immediate circumstances, immediate emotion, and immediate temptation exert their full, considerable pressure in the opposite direction. This capacity does not arrive naturally, nor does it arrive permanently once developed. It requires the kind of sustained, deliberate cultivation we have examined throughout this study, practiced consistently across years and decades, precisely because the underlying cognitive architecture favoring short-sightedness never fully disappears, regardless of how thoroughly it has been intellectually understood and previously overridden. Master this discipline, however, and you gain access to something considerably more valuable than mere protection against any single category of costly decision. You gain the capacity to operate consistently and reliably on a longer time horizon than the great majority of the people and institutions you will encounter across any sufficiently long career, a capacity that compounded patiently across years and decades frequently proves to be among the single most decisive advantages available to anyone seriously committed to building achievement, reputation, and security substantial enough to withstand the inevitable pressures, temptations, and immediate gratifications that this ancient, deeply embedded law will continue for as long as you live, attempting to place in your path. There is a particular kind of disappearance that has nothing to do with physical absence. You can be standing directly across from this person, holding a conversation, sharing a meal, even sharing a bed, and still experience the unmistakable sensation that they are, in some essential way, not actually there. Questions about their feelings receive vague, deflecting answers. Requests for commitment dissolve into non-committal agreement that never quite translates into action. Conflicts that genuinely require resolution simply evaporate, unaddressed, replaced by a return to surface-level pleasantness that leaves the underlying issue exactly where it started, buried, unresolved, and quietly accumulating beneath the relationship like sediment at the bottom of a still lake. This is the unmistakable signature of the avoider, one of the most common, most quietly corrosive, and most consistently misunderstood character types in the entire landscape of human relationships. He rarely announces himself through dramatic confrontation, the way the aggressor does. He rarely demands constant admiration, the way the narcissist does. His damage is slower, subtler, and in many ways, more insidious, precisely because it operates not through what he does, but through what he persistently, strategically fails to do. To understand this character properly, we must begin by examining what, precisely, the avoider is avoiding, because the casual surface description, person who dislikes conflict, who struggles with commitment, who seems perpetually reluctant to engage fully, captures only the visible symptom rather than the underlying mechanism. The true avoider is not simply someone who finds conflict and intimacy unpleasant, in the way most people find them at least somewhat uncomfortable. He is someone for whom genuine emotional engagement, genuine vulnerability, and genuine accountability represent something closer to existential threat and danger significant enough to justify an entire lifetime organized around its careful, systematic evasion. This pattern, like so many of the character types worth studying closely, typically has its roots in early childhood experience, though the specific developmental pathway differs meaningfully from that of the narcissist or the aggressor. Where the narcissist often emerges from a childhood of conditional approval tied to performance and image, and the aggressor frequently emerges from environments where dominance and submission structured every significant relationship, the avoider's formation typically traces back to an early environment characterized by emotional unpredictability, intrusion, or overwhelming demand, conditions under which the developing child learned that emotional closeness itself carried unacceptable risk. Consider a child raised by a caregiver who was, perhaps, inconsistently available, warm and attentive in some moments, distant or overwhelmed in others, in a pattern the child could never reliably predict or control. Or consider a child raised within an environment of intense emotional intrusion, where privacy and autonomy were rarely respected, where the child's own developing sense of self was perpetually at risk of being overridden by a caregiver's anxiety, expectations, or unprocessed emotional needs. In either scenario, and in numerous variations upon this basic theme, the child arrives at a similar conclusion, absorbed not through conscious reasoning, but through the much deeper, more durable learning that occurs at the level of nervous system and attachment pattern. Closeness is dangerous. Dependence on another person's emotional availability leads, reliably, to disappointment, overwhelm, or loss of self. Safety lies not in connection, but in the careful maintenance of distance. This conclusion, formed long before the child possesses the cognitive sophistication to concrete or question it, becomes the organizing principle around which an entire adult personality eventually constructs itself. The avoider does not consciously choose, as an adult, to sabotage his relationships, to withhold commitment, to disappear precisely when his presence is most needed. He is, in a very real sense, executing a survival strategy developed in early childhood, one that continues operating with the same urgency and the same underlying logic, regardless of how thoroughly his adult circumstances may have changed, and regardless of how genuinely he may, at a conscious level, wish for connection, intimacy, and lasting commitment. This explains one of the most painful and confusing aspects of relationships with avoiders, the aspect that so frequently leaves their partners, friends, and colleagues feeling as though they are losing their grip on reality. The sincere, often quite convincing expression of genuine desire for closeness, immediately followed by behavior that systematically undermines and prevents exactly that closeness from occurring. The avoider is rarely lying when he expresses a wish for deeper connection. He typically means it, genuinely and sincerely, at the moment he says it. But the deeper, older survival programming, the one formed long before conscious intention, had any influence over his emotional architecture, continues operating beneath that sincere wish, generating an almost automatic retreat the moment actual intimacy begins to materialize. The moment vulnerability becomes more than a hypothetical future possibility and starts to feel like an immediate present reality. Consider in detail the particular rhythm this produces within romantic relationships, because it is here that the avoider's pattern often becomes most visible, most painful, and most consistently misunderstood by those caught within it. In the early stages of a new relationship, before genuine emotional stakes have accumulated, the avoider frequently presents as charming, engaged, even unusually romantic. This is not contrary to what many exhausted partners eventually come to believe: simple manipulation or deliberate deception. The early stages of a relationship carry comparatively low emotional risk precisely because nothing significant has yet been built that could be lost. The avoider can engage warmly during this phase precisely because genuine vulnerability has not yet been required of him. As the relationship deepens, however, as genuine intimacy, genuine dependence, genuine mutual vulnerability begin to accumulate, the avoider's underlying alarm system activates, often without his full conscious awareness of why his behavior is shifting. He becomes with increasing frequency suddenly busy, suddenly distracted, suddenly less available, precisely at the moments when the relationship's natural trajectory would call for increased closeness rather than retreat. Arguments that would, in a healthier relational pattern, lead toward deeper mutual understanding, instead get deflected, minimized, or simply abandoned mid-conversation. Quests for clearer commitment, for defined plans, for explicit acknowledgement of the relationship's significance, receive vague, non-committal responses that technically avoid outright rejection while simultaneously avoiding any genuine forward movement. This produces, for the avoider's partner, an exhausting and deeply destabilizing experience often described, by those who have lived through it, as something close to romantic vertigo, genuine warmth and connection alternating, unpredictably, with sudden withdrawal and distance, in a pattern that leaves the partner perpetually uncertain of their actual standing, perpetually working to recapture a level of closeness that seemed, only recently, to have been genuinely present and mutual. It is worth pausing here to address directly a critical strategic insight, because it explains a great deal about why relationships with avoiders so frequently follow a particular, self-perpetuating destructive cycle. The natural human response to a partner's withdrawal is increased pursuit, an intensification of effort to restore the lost closeness, additional reassurance, additional attempts at communication, additional demonstrations of commitment intended to convince the withdrawing partner that the relationship is safe and worth remaining vulnerable within. This response, however natural and however well-intentioned, frequently produces precisely the opposite of its intended effect with a genuine avoider. Increased pursuit registers within the avoider's underlying threat detection system, not as reassurance but as escalating pressure. Additional confirmation that closeness leads, as his earliest experiences taught him, to overwhelming demand. The result is frequently further withdrawal, met by further pursuit, in an escalating cycle that researchers studying attachment patterns have come to recognize as one of the most common and most destructive dynamics in failing relationships. The pursuer growing increasingly desperate and increasingly resentful. The avoider growing increasingly overwhelmed and increasingly distant. Each partner's natural response to the relationship's growing distress directly intensifying the very pattern that produced the distress in the first place. Consider, too, the avoider's particular relationship to conflict and accountability, a pattern that extends well beyond romantic relationships into friendships, family dynamics, and professional environments alike, where the aggressor actively seeks conflict as an arena for asserting dominance. The avoider experiences conflict as something closer to a physical threat, to be escaped at almost any cost. This produces a characteristic set of behaviors immediately recognizable to anyone who has attempted to resolve a genuine disagreement with a true avoider. Sudden topic changes precisely when a conversation approaches uncomfortable territory. Vague non-answers that technically respond to a question without actually committing to any clear position. A tendency to simply leave the room, end the phone call, or stop responding to messages entirely. When a conflict reaches a level of intensity, the avoider finds intolerable and a remarkable, almost reflexive talent for minimizing the significance of issues that, to everyone else involved, clearly require genuine resolution. This avoidance of direct conflict frequently produces an unintended but devastating consequence within long-term relationships and professional partnerships alike. The gradual accumulation of unaddressed grievances, unresolved resentments, and unspoken expectations that, precisely because they were never directly confronted and worked through, never actually resolve, they simply accumulate quietly beneath the surface of an outwardly calm relationship until they eventually reach a critical mass that produces, often with startling and confusing suddenness to outside observers, complete and final withdrawal, frequently with little or no warning. That leaves the avoider's partner or colleague genuinely bewildered, having believed, based on the outward absence of visible conflict, that the relationship had been functioning reasonably well. This pattern, sudden, seemingly unprovoked withdrawal or termination of a relationship that appeared outwardly stable, represents one of the most distinctive and most painful signatures of the true avoider. And understanding its underlying mechanism, the slow, invisible accumulation of unaddressed grievance beneath an outwardly calm surface, transforms what initially appears bewildering and inexplicable into something considerably more predictable and considerably easier to anticipate. Consider, finally, the avoider's relationship to his own internal emotional life, because here we encounter perhaps the most subtle and most consequential aspect of this character type. It would be inaccurate to assume that the avoider simply experiences less emotion than some people, that his withdrawal reflects some genuine absence of feeling beneath the calm, deflecting exterior. The more accurate and more useful understanding is that the avoider has developed, across an entire lifetime, an extraordinarily effective capacity for disconnecting from his own emotional experience precisely at the moments when that experience threatens to become overwhelming. This is not simple repression in the crude sense, but something closer to a practiced, automatic redirection of attention away from internal emotional states and toward external tasks, distractions, and obligations, a strategy that proves remarkably effective at maintaining a sense of calm, controlled functioning, while simultaneously preventing the kind of deep emotional processing that genuine intimacy and genuine conflict resolution both require. This explains why avoiders so frequently present, to outside observers, as unusually calm, competent, and self-sufficient individuals, often admired precisely for the qualities that make genuine intimacy with them so difficult. Their apparent imperviousness to emotional disturbance, their capacity to remain functional and productive amid circumstances that would visibly distress most people, their general reluctance to burden others with their own emotional needs. These qualities, genuinely valuable in many contexts, particularly professional ones, frequently mask a far more troubling underlying reality: profound and largely unconscious disconnection from the avoider's own interior emotional life, one that prevents not only genuine intimacy with others, but genuine self-knowledge as well. History and biography offer numerous illustrations of this pattern, operating at a scale extending well beyond individual romantic relationships. And it is worth examining several of these illustrations closely, because the avoider's pattern, once properly understood, becomes recognizable across remarkably different contexts and eras. Consider the particular trajectory common among certain historically accomplished individuals whose professional brilliance and outward composure masked a persistent, lifelong pattern of relational instability. Individuals whose biographies, examined closely, reveal a consistent inability to sustain genuine intimate partnership, despite repeated attempts and repeated genuine desire to do so. Such individuals frequently describe, in their own private writings and correspondence, a sense of bafflement at their own pattern of behavior, a genuine wish for lasting connection, paired with an equally genuine, seemingly involuntary tendency to retreat, to find fault, to manufacture distance, precisely as relationships approached the depth of intimacy that, on a conscious level, they claimed to want most. Consider, too, the particular dynamic frequently observed within long-running professional partnerships and collaborations, where one partner's consistent avoidance of direct conflict and clear commitment gradually produces a slow, quiet erosion of trust and mutual investment, even in the complete absence of any single, dramatic incident that might explain the partnership's eventual dissolution. Colleagues and business partners working alongside a true avoider frequently report a similar pattern to that observed in romantic relationships: genuine competence and apparent cooperation during periods of low stakes and minimal direct confrontation, followed by a troubling pattern of unavailability, vagueness, and deflection precisely when significant decisions, difficult conversations, or genuine accountability become necessary, ultimately producing a partnership that, despite years of apparently functional collaboration, never develops the depth of trust and mutual reliance that more direct, more consistently engaged partnerships manage to build. What then can be done? How does one navigate relationships, whether romantic, familial, or professional, with this particular character type, without either becoming trapped in an exhausting, self-perpetuating cycle of pursuit and withdrawal, or abandoning entirely the possibility of meaningful connection with someone who, beneath the defensive pattern, frequently possesses genuine warmth, genuine intelligence, and genuine capacity for partnership? The first essential principle requires a significant adjustment to instinct for most people, particularly those whose own attachment patterns incline naturally toward pursuit and reassurance seeking when a relationship begins to feel unstable. With a genuine avoider, the most effective response to withdrawal is rarely increased pursuit, however natural that impulse may feel. It is, instead, a calm, secure, non-anxious steadiness, a demonstrated capacity to remain emotionally regulated and genuinely unbothered by the avoider's retreat, neither chasing after reassurance nor retaliating with anger or ultimatums. This steadiness communicates something the avoider's underlying threat detection system finds, over time, considerably more reassuring than either pursuit or punishment. That closeness with you does not, in fact, lead to the overwhelming demand or unpredictable intrusion his earliest experiences taught him to expect. Second essential principle involves the careful, patient establishment of safety, specifically around conflict and accountability, recognizing that the avoider's flight response to direct confrontation is not a deliberate strategy of evasion so much as a deeply ingrained, largely automatic survival reaction. This means addressing necessary conflicts calmly, in low-key, non-escalating language, avoiding the kind of intense emotional pressure that triggers the avoider's flight response, while simultaneously and consistently refusing to allow genuinely important issues to be permanently deflected or minimized away. This balance, calm but persistent, gentle but unwilling to be indefinitely postponed, proves considerably more effective than either aggressive confrontation, which triggers immediate flight, or complete avoidance of difficult topics, which simply perpetuates the underlying pattern indefinitely. The third essential principle, and perhaps the most difficult for many people to accept, involves recognizing the genuine limits of what patience, understanding, and skillful communication can actually accomplish with this character type. While a degree of avoidant pattern exists on a spectrum, many individuals with moderate avoidant tendencies can, given sufficient safety, patience, and skillful partnership, gradually develop greater capacity for genuine intimacy and accountability over time. A smaller proportion of true avoiders have constructed defensive patterns so deeply entrenched, so thoroughly woven into their fundamental sense of safety that no amount of patient, skillful effort from a partner will produce meaningful change absent the avoider's own genuine, internally motivated commitment to examining and addressing the pattern, typically through dedicated therapeutic work undertaken specifically for that purpose. Recognizing when you have encountered this more entrenched version of the pattern and adjusting your own expectations and investments accordingly protects you from the considerable and often unrecognized cost of investing years of patient effort into a dynamic that was never, absent a change, the other person was unwilling or unable to make, going to produce the genuine intimacy and reliability you were hoping to eventually achieve. There is, finally, a broader and more reflective dimension to studying the avoider closely, one that extends well beyond practical relationship strategy into a deeper understanding of vulnerability itself and our own complicated relationship to it. The avoider represents, in a particularly clear and instructive form, a tendency that exists to some degree within every human psychology, the temptation to protect oneself from the genuine risks of intimacy, accountability, and emotional exposure by constructing careful, well-practiced strategies of distance and deflection, strategies that succeed, in the narrow sense, at preventing certain kinds of pain, while simultaneously preventing access to the depth of connection, understanding, mutual support that only genuine vulnerability can provide. Studying this character closely then offers not only practical guidance for navigating relationships with those who display this pattern in pronounced form, but also an opportunity for honest self-examination, an invitation to consider where, in your own life, the temptation toward avoidance, toward maintaining safe distance rather than risking genuine exposure, might be quietly limiting the depth of connection available to you, even in relationships where the underlying conditions for genuine intimacy and trust are, in fact, present and available, if only you were willing to risk the vulnerability that accessing them requires. The avoider, like every character type worth studying closely, is neither simply a villain to be defeated, nor simply a victim to be endlessly accommodated. He is rather particular and instructive demonstration of how early experience shapes adult pattern, how genuine desire for connection can coexist within a single person, alongside an equally genuine, often unconscious drive to prevent that very connection from fully materializing, and how understanding this contradiction, rather than simply reacting to its confusing surface behavior, offers the clearest path toward either successfully navigating a relationship with this character type or recognizing, with appropriate clarity, when the underlying pattern has become too entrenched to productively engage with at all. Master this understanding, and you gain something considerably more valuable than simple protection from a particular frustrating relational dynamic. You would gain a clearer, more compassionate, and ultimately more strategic understanding of one of the most common obstacles standing between genuine human connection and the elaborate, well-practiced defenses so many people, in ways large and small, have constructed against the very intimacy they claim, often quite sincerely, to want most.